Welcome to Rosie the Reviewer. We're your hosts. I'm Sam,
And I'm Maartje.
and we like World War II media, and we want to talk about it. Welcome back to Rosie the Reviewer. This week we are discussing the movie Unbroken, which came out in 2014. It was directed by Angelina Jolie, and it was written by the famous Coen brothers, Richard LaGranovise and William Nicholson. And it's based on the biographical nonfiction book of the same name by Laura Hillenbrand, which came out in 2010.
I should mention that I've not read the book, but I have seen the movie twice because I didn't remember it the first time.
So that just gives you some indication of how remarkable it was.
So I want to start with ranking this movie because it's gonna annoy me if I don't. Story-wise, I would give it a 7.5 out of 10, which is pretty good. But
Out of 10?
out of 10, yeah.
That's higher than I was expecting based on how you were talking about it.
Yeah, I think the story is really good. Just the movie making is so bad. So I would give the movie making an actual 3 or something.
I'm already amused about the fact that in our first few episodes, we definitely ranked out of 5, and now we have completely adjusted the ranking system to be out of 10.
I'm well like that. I don't care. But
Listen, we don't follow. Okay.
If it had been like a good movie as well as a good story, it would have gotten higher score for me. I don't like the way it was made.
Right. And I have read the book, actually. And I'm glad that we're finally doing this podcast because I actually borrowed the book from someone on my weekly trivia team. And she's been very kind about not asking for it back, but I have had it for a while. So now I'll be able to return it and not be a delinquent book stealer.
That's why we make podcasts, really, so you can give the books back finally.
Exactly. So I did read the book and I thought the story was very fascinating, but I did not really enjoy the movie as an adaptation. So kind of on the same page as you with that one.
Right. So what would you rate the movie then?
Oh gosh. Well, out of 10, oh gosh, maybe it's just very forgettable to me. Maybe like a 5. It wasn't the worst. I mean, I'm not like, give me my 2 hours back. Angelina Jolie, you owe me money, but I didn't love it.
And would you read the book again, which is a better rating, I think, than just rating a book?
Yeah, I would say the book is quite good. It's by the author of Seabiscuit. So she's written a couple of, historical books that have been made into movies. And the way she tells the story, like the narrative is very compelling. It almost kind of reads like a novel, even though it's not. So I quite enjoyed it. And the book gives us kind of a wider focus, I think. We follow a few more players in the main character's story, and we find out a lot more about what happened to him after the war. So we get more of a complete tale, I guess.
So did you see the movie first or did you read the book first?
Oh, I read the book first.
As you should, because apparently it's better. Should we go event by event and kind of compare the book to the movie, maybe?
For sure. So the movie opens on a bombing mission over the Pacific in April of 1943. And we're introduced to our main character, Louis Zamperini, as played by Jack O'Connell, who is great in everything. So literally zero shade on Jack O'Connell for any of this. And he's a bombardier on a flight crew, and the mission that they're on comes to a harrowing end. They have a near miss. They don't land properly. Some of the guys are grievously injured or killed.
Yes, they are. We then flash back to his youth as he grows up in California. We find out he's kind of a rebel, but he's also very good at running, which comes in handy apparently when you're a rebel. He ends up kind of finding his place by becoming a runner in high school, and he's very good, and then ends up becoming an Olympic runner in the 1936 Olympics in Berlin, I want to say.
So just to provide a little bit more context and information about Louis going to the Olympics, he was a distance runner, and normally distance runners get better as they mature. So there are a lot of sports where you're going to see people medaling when they're 19 or 20 years old, but distance running isn't one of those. Typically, you see older runners winning medals. And so when he competed in the 1936 Olympics, he was really young still. They thought, he'll probably do okay this time. And they were right. I believe he came in 8th. And he ran one of the fastest laps that had ever been run in an Olympics. But they knew that he was probably not really going to hit his stride until the 1940 Olympics, and that's when he might medal. And unfortunately for him,
The war started.
the unfortunate thing too is that running was such a big thing for him, right? Like that's what really got him out of that troubled childhood that he had. And when he got home from the war, he tried to get back into running. And unfortunately, he was beaten so badly in one of the camps that it screwed up his ankle and he wasn't able to run distances anymore.
War sucks, you guys.
Yeah. So he actually, after the Olympics in 1938, he set the national collegiate mile record. And just to give you some idea, he was running races, or he would run the mile in 4 minutes, 7 seconds, 4 minutes, 8 seconds. And if you're someone like me who thinks that they should put a Joe Blow in the Olympics, just to give you an idea of how impressive these athletes really are in comparison, I'll be your Joe Blow. When I was training for my marathon, I would do shorter, faster races or shorter, faster runs just to try and up my speed. And the fastest miles I ever clocked were like maybe 7.5 minutes. So a 4 minute mile is really no joke. And he was regarded as one of the strongest contenders to break the 4 minute barrier in the mile run for the first time in recorded history.
You need to explain something to me. Well, a couple things actually, because what is a Joe Blow?
A Joe Blow is just a random person on the street, just a normie.
Oh, all right. And another thing, people who are listening might know this, but I don't walk. So I've got no idea how fast he's going. I've got no sense of how fast any of this is, but it sounds really impressive.
Yeah. Well, it certainly was. He was the youngest distance runner ever to make the Olympic team at the time.
How old was he, do you know?
He was, gosh, because we recorded the first part of this episode on a different day, I don't remember what year he was born, but I think he might have been 19 or so.
He was very young. I remember him getting on the train and talking to his brother. And I think he was still pretty much a kid.
Yeah, he was pretty young. And he actually, at the Olympics, he got into some Louis typical mishaps. His coach had told Jesse Owens, the famous runner, to keep an eye out on him because Jesse was a bit more mature, I guess. And Louis nearly got shot trying to steal a Nazi flag.
Oh no.
Yeah.
Even then, even in the 1936 Olympics?
Oh yeah, he tried to steal one and he got caught, and he managed to talk his way out of it by saying that, "Oh, I just want a souvenir of this nice time that I've had in Germany." But oh yeah, I mean, they took it real serious.
I wish more of his kind of rebelness, that's not a word, rebelliousness was in the movie, because not a lot is shown of him just misbehaving.
I know. And we don't get much of his running career either. I mean, he also at the Olympics, he also met Hitler and Hitler complimented his time. So
Oh God.
his whole run at the Olympics is fascinating. It's kind of disappointing that very little of it was included in the film.
And there's another movie about these Olympics called The Boys in a Boat, which is about a row crew, and it features Callum Turner as the main character, who you might know from the recent Masters of the Air, which I thought would be an interesting mention if you want to watch something good.
Which is kind of fun because it's another plane movie.
It is, yeah. We like our bomber movies over here. Or do we?
So in the book, we get a lot more detail about Louis's childhood, and he really had a hard time. He ran away from home. He broke into places and stole things. He was constantly getting in trouble. He rode the rails for a little while. He was getting into brawls. Like, this kid was big trouble. And his family didn't really know what to do with them. I mean, his teachers were at their wits' end, his family's at their wits' end. So him getting into running really kind of saved him and gave him focus and made him, grow up into the kind of person who would be able to like hold down a job and not be in and out of jail and that kind of stuff.
Wait, is he Danny Zuko from Greece? Then?
I guess.
Maybe. But it's funny, you mentioned like he gets into lots of trouble, but if you watch the movie, more of a victim than he is a troublemaker. They do say that he's kind of going in the wrong direction or whatever, but you don't really see him do anything he shouldn't be doing.
Yeah.
But
They go into that a lot more in the book. I mean, it's true that he does face some anti-Italian racism, which I think they also depict in the movie. But really, he is kind of a kid who spends a lot of time getting into hot water.
speaking of water, I guess maybe this is a segue that works, I don't know. We return to 1943 in the movie, and we find Louis and his remaining crewmates. One of them is named Alan Phillips, which I didn't know because they call him Phil for the entirety of the movie, which is one of my gripes really with this movie. Anyway, Phil was played by Donald Gleason, and he and Louis and some other people find a new crew for their plane and go on a rescue mission to find another downed crew who went down overseas, which does not end well for them because they end up crashing into the ocean as well, with a kind of fatal ending for most of them. So Louis, Phil, and another crew member named Mac, who I've got no idea what his actual name is, end up in a rubber boat trying to survive out on the seas. And
Yeah,
they end.
they in the book they go into more detail about, I guess, when they were before they were leaving to fly their rescue mission, there were quite a lot of things wrong with the plane, like technical issues, and they knew that it was probably going to be an issue and they had to go up in it anyway. So,
Unfortunately, they end up in the water, being stranded on a raft for 47 days, which is pretty insane if you think about it. Like, how do you even survive? Which is a good question because Meg doesn't, she dies. And they fight sharks, they fight hunger very intensely. And then they are strafed by a fighter plane as well, which is brutal. Pretty harrowing, to be honest.
yeah, it's bad news all around. And that was apparently a big issue in the Pacific because a lot of these bombers would end up going down. And when that happened, I mean, the Pacific is massive, obviously. And so they would fly rescue missions, but honestly, when you're that high up, it's just hard to see guys in the water. So a lot of the times, even if guys did survive, they weren't going to make it for very long.
And I think they see a plane very early on, and they like try and alert it, but they're not, they're just missed by this plane.
Right,
Kind of
exactly.
rough.
And they're also aware of, I think the record at that point they say is something like 21 days or something like that of guys who survived on a raft.
They
And they're
talk about
counting.
it, right? They talk about it on the raft.
Yeah,
Like it's a,
exactly.
yeah, I remember this. I'm looking at my notes. I've also written again the boys in the boat. But these guys are also the boys in the boat because they end up on a raft. But they also eat an albatross, I believe, is what I've written down. And then I just say poor Mac because he dies. Just sad.
Well, so they try to eat the albatross, but it's just disgusting. So they end up using it as bait to catch fish and sharks, I
Very,
gather.
very true. And then they giggle over Louis' mother's gnocchi, which is very cute and
Yeah,
also
so
very sad.
it comes up often in the book that Louis talks about food all the time. It's like his thing. He was known for that. So people who
Right.
were in camps with him who only maybe met him a couple of times were like, "Oh yeah, I remember that guy. He just talked about food a lot."
It's
Yeah.
funny because you wouldn't know that unless you'd read the book. So the movie does this a lot, I feel. There's a couple
Yeah.
things that aren't explained in this movie, which are explained in the book. It just doesn't make any sense to me in the movie. Like, also,
Yeah.
why would you be talking about food if you're starving? It just doesn't.
Well,
Yeah,
I guess he was doing it he was describing how his mom would cook food and how good the food was, and it gave them something to think about so they could imagine eating food because they just hadn't
right.
eaten really a proper meal in so long.
I'm just trying to imagine what 47 days on a raft would be like.
Well, and at first, I mean, they weren't sure how they were gonna get water, but then there was a massive rainstorm, so they figured out how to MacGyver some containers so they could keep water and save it for later. And they this is touched on in the movie, but they go into it quite a lot more in the book about how there was just constantly sharks and the sharks would be knocking up against the raft and just waiting for their opportunity.
Waiting to eat them, I guess. And
Exactly. And so when I was reading the book, at this point, you're not even halfway in the book, I don't think. And you're just like, this guy has been through so much already. But then, unfortunately for him and his buddies, well, his buddy, I guess, because Phil's the only one left, they end up being picked up by a Japanese ship and they become prisoners of war on Kwajalein Atoll. I'm probably butchered that, but that's what it's called, where they end up being interrogated and The book goes into quite a bit of detail about how Louis was careful to only give information that he thought they probably already had, or he would deliberately be misleading, but provide them just enough information that they thought that he was telling the truth.
So did them making up the radio also happen in real life?
Yeah, or something similar to that anyways, yeah.
I think they asked Louis to draw a northern bomb site, I believe, in the movie. And he tells Phil, "Hey, listen, I drew this radio with two knobs on the side or something."
Yeah,
And
I'm not sure if that exactly happens in the book, but it's something similar to that. So they don't have a very good time. They're sleeping in these tiny little shacks in the book where it's described that they constantly have to lay down with their faces near the hole where they go to the bathroom. And if they don't, then they're going to get beat up by the guards. And then anytime there's a Japanese submarine crew that comes through, they want to get their chance to go in and beat up the prisoners. So that happens. They're not getting enough food. They're just having generally a bad time. Louis meets this one Japanese guard who's a Christian and like tries to treat him a little better and give him some food and maybe prevent some of the beatings, but it doesn't go that well. So
so I wonder, we see some of this. We don't see what exactly happens, but we see him getting, I think it's rice or something. We see him getting food, and we also hear watch Louis as he hears Phil getting beat up in the next to him. So they allude to all of it but don't show anything, which is kind of, I feel like this movie does that a lot. There's a lot of things that must have really happened, but they're never explained. So you can't exactly learn the details of anything that happened to them from this movie.
yeah, it's a lot of ground to cover in a 2-hour movie. I mean, like
There.
so much of the book is about, for example, how hungry they were and the role of food and the way food is being withheld and all that kind of stuff. It's just a constant theme, and that doesn't really get articulated in the movie. And there's all kinds of little things like that that to me give you a more complete picture and make the book fascinating. And then in the movie, the story just kind of feels a bit two-dimensional because of that, but maybe it's just because I read the book first.
Could be. Yeah, well, I also thought I have not read the book, and I feel like a lot of things were just glossed over quite a bit. So,
Yeah. Well, I
and
mean, the next
I don't know the story though, so I don't know what exactly is being glossed over, but it felt like some things needed more context.
Yeah, I mean, another thing is the next thing that happens in the movie is they get shipped to mainland Japan where Louis and Phil are sent to two separate POW camps. But what the book does really well is that players in Louis' story, like Phil, the book follows them throughout the rest of the war. So you find out what happens to Phil and that he eventually does get to go home and marry his sweetheart and all this stuff. And in the movie, that's it. You never find out what happens to him until the end.
Yeah,
And
you do get his little end card kind of shot, but that's all you get. So
yeah, and then also this part of the movie skips over an entire year. So in the book and in real life, I guess, Louis was sent to this camp called Ofuna, and it was a black site, unlisted camp where prisoners who were sent there because they were seen to be high value in some sort of way, or maybe they could interrogate them and get information from them. So they were never registered as prisoners of war with the Red Cross, which meant that they didn't have to be treated according to the guidelines of prisoners of war. So Louis spent a year
right.
where he was quite egregiously mistreated. They never had enough food. It was, he had a good friend in that camp, Will Harris, who doesn't get mentioned in the movie, who they try to plan an escape together. And Will Harris ends up having not a super great time. He gets beaten really badly and it permanently affects his health. And they also in the book talk about this Japanese American guy that Louis went to college with. And he meets him again in the camp because now this guy's working for the Japanese. So there's all this kind of, like a huge volume of things that happen in the book that they just skip right over in the movie.
And also, that doesn't sound like a bad movie plot either. It's not like it's boring stuff. It's very action packed, actually. So why would they skip that part?
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, like we said before, it's a lot of content to cover in 2 hours. And to a certain extent, I am nitpicking, but there were so many parts of the book that I thought were neat and then I was disappointed not to see them in the movie.
I feel like maybe like some of the rafty business, as I like to call it now, that was a pretty long thing. I guess you want to emphasize how long 30 of 47 days is, but still,
Yeah.
I, yeah, I don't know. I just found it really like, as far as the movie goes, I found it kind of slow, which is strange because so much happens. But the pacing is just really strange.
It was strange, and I find maybe because they cut certain parts of the story out and we don't get to kind of follow Louis' emotional journey exactly as it happened. To me, there's not a lot to kind of grab onto with the character. He's very, of course, like stoic and strong and whatever in the movie, but honestly, part of the book that was so fascinating was the fact that Louis was kind of a shit disturber, and we don't really get a strong sense of that in the movie.
No, I would sooner see like I wrote down what I thought the theme of the movie was, which I think is it's a movie about endurance, right? And perseverance in the face of adversity. But
Yeah.
I feel like it would have been so much stronger if we'd seen maybe a little bit more action from Louis because he gets kind of thrown into all sorts of stuff. But if I listen to you talk about the book, I would think he would get into stuff on purpose more than he does in the movie.
Yeah. So that kind of brings us to the next part where Louis ends up being in a prisoner of war camp just outside of Tokyo. And he ends up making an enemy of Corporal Mutsuhiro Watanabe, who's played by Miyavi in the movie. And this corporal goes out of his way to torture Louis. And it's not super made clear why in the movie. So the book gets more into, so they call Watanabe the bird, that's his nickname. And the book
Right.
gets more, of course, into the nitty-gritty of the bird's personal animosity for Louis. And part of it was that Louis was already coming from this black site unlisted prisoner of war camp where he
It
had
was
obviously been.
special, kind of.
Yeah, so he was already kind of set apart from the other prisoners. He was special and other, and he had been, an Olympic runner. He was famous enough. People knew who he was, that he had been in the 1936 Olympics. And when he first got to the camp, Louis just had this kind of personality where he didn't take direction very well. He wasn't great with authority, and the bird got that sense from him and took it really personally. I
I,
think the actor who plays Watanabe is absolutely great in the film, but I felt like we didn't get maybe enough sense of why that relationship was the way it was.
do we also know why he's called the bird? Because in the movie they say we call him the bird because we don't want anyone to overhear the other names we call him. That's what they say in the movie.
Yeah, exactly. They have a bunch of different nicknames for him, but essentially they don't want to be overheard calling him something derogatory.
So it's just a nickname that doesn't really mean anything then. It's just the name he gets.
Yeah, there's quite a lot of sort of nitty-gritty stuff in the book, but part of it is that Louis is an officer, and according to the Geneva Conventions, the officers are not supposed to be put to work in the same way that the enlisted men are, because the officers are still expected to lead the men even when they're in a prisoner of war camp. And because they're not allowed to work, they only get half rations of food. Because if you're not working, you don't get full rations of food. And so the bird and other people who were in charge of the camp would weaponize this against the men. So sometimes they would try and force the officers to work, and that did happen quite a bit. And then other times they would say, no, you can't work. Louis was at a point in the camp where he was begging the bird to give him work to do so that he could get full rations because he was so hungry.
That's insane. I didn't know that about the officers not being allowed to work and then also getting I mean it makes sense from like a work point of view to then say, well, if you don't work you don't need full rations. So here's half of one.
Right.
That's
At the end of the war, too, they found out that the Red Cross had been sending all these packages to the prisoners that they never got. All the
wow.
packages were just distributed amongst
Without
the.
so I'll move on to the next bit of the movie. The American government tells the American people that Louis is killed in action, which, as we know, he's very much still alive. So the Japanese kind of call him up and say, look, we want you to go onto this radio show called hello postman, I believe, or something like that, to let his
Yeah.
mother know that he's still alive. So he does. He goes in and he records a message for his mother and his brother and his friends. But it is never really explained in the movie why the Japanese ask Americans to come on their show and talk. So we've been talking about this off
Right.
air.
Yeah, it kinda gets treated as just another way to show that Louis is a badass who doesn't do what he's told. But they had asked him essentially at this point, the Japanese government were trying to show the American people that they couldn't trust their own government and they couldn't believe what their own government was saying. And so the US government had declared Louis killed in action because that's just what they did if 13 months after a plane went down, they didn't know what had happened to the person. And because Louis had been in these black site camps, he had never been listed as a prisoner of war anywhere. So the government assumed that he was dead and declared him killed in action. And so the Japanese government got him on the radio making an announcement that he was still alive so that the American people would not trust what they had been told by the government.
Right. And then afterwards, he gets invited to do another broadcast and he refuses. We see him hold a piece of paper with his broadcast on it. That's in very typical American. But he says, I won't do this because it's a lie. I won't say this about my own country because, of course, we're trying to undermine America. Right? But he doesn't do it and he returns. He could have had nice food and shelter, but he returns to the camp. And as he returns, shortly after he returns, Watanabe leaves the camp because he's promoted, he says. But we don't really know why he gets promoted. So, Sam, please fill this in for us.
Right. So actually, when Louis is at the radio station recording his broadcast, he encounters a friendly producer and happens to be able to get him a message saying, "Look, this guy is a psychopath. He's torturing us, etc." And a combination of this and some other stories that have been getting back to the hires up really sort of underlined that the bird or Watanabe was becoming a problem. Part of this was that he was an NCO, but he essentially ran that camp. And none of the officers would stand up to him because he came from a rich family and he was quite unpredictable and volatile.
Should we very shortly and quickly explain the difference between an NCO and an officer for those who don't know?
Right.
Because
So he had
I don't
actually
know if our audience knows the difference.
Right. So he had actually wanted to be an officer and he had tried to sign up for officer training because you have to go to school if you want to be an officer. And he was rejected. And so he had to enlist and he became a non commissioned officer and he had a huge chip on his shoulder about that.
But
Yeah,
then he was promoted, and very much like Captain Sobel in Band of Brothers, he was sent away to a different camp.
exactly. They were like, well, we need to get him away from this camp, but we don't want it to make it seem like he's in trouble. So we're going to transfer him to a new posting, but we're also going to promote him.
And of course, then in the movie, we think, Jesus, finally, Louis from this demon that's plaguing his life. But then,
Yeah. So Louis finds out that he is also being transferred to a new camp. And in the book, he's very excited about this because he thinks that anywhere that he goes can't possibly be worse than the camp where he's been. And he gets to this new camp at Naotsu, and it turns out that the bird is there. And in the book, it's explained that it's likely that the bird was able to choose a list of prisoners, and he chose Louis deliberately to come there so he could continue to torture him, essentially.
I'm being slightly sarcastic at this point.
Yeah,
Watanabe is a bully that keeps following him around, which is like, I feel like Louis in this movie gets to deal with a lot of bullies and load of like situations that are sort of shitty, like almost losing the Olympics and then winning, and then like surviving his first crash and then almost dying a second time. So he keeps having to overcome all these hardships, but
right. And there's a
it's a
certain
shitty life, really, to lead.
Yeah, and in the book, he does say that his time at Noetsu was probably the worst point of the war. It was his lowest point.
We should probably explain that this camp what they are made to do at this camp is carry coal on coal barges. This is very dirty and I think also very unhealthy work. Not to mention they are starved and tired and just having an altogether very bad time.
Right. And Louis is dealing with this guy, the bird, who's basically following him around. And any opportunity that he has, he'll find a reason to torture him, find something that he did wrong. And there's this kind of impression that you get from the book where every now and again, the bird is almost acting like he thinks that these guys are friends of his and that they all like him. And then 10 minutes later, he's beating them up. Like he's kind of back and forth. He's hot and cold.
I believe he says, even in the movie, he says it's at the previous camp in the scene where right before Louis gets, or the prisoners get ordered to punch Louis in the face after he
Yeah.
returns. He says, I look at you and I see we're the same, and I thought this guy's gonna be my friend. Like, he even says it, and then he orders all the men to beat Louis in the face. And I don't know how many prisoners there were, but many.
Yeah, and that did happen in the book too. There was quite a lot of
Wow.
really brutal depictions of torture in the book and in the movie, and in fact, there was some outcry in Japan when the book and the movie came out because people said that the depiction was racist.
For the Japanese?
Correct.
Like, right. Wow.
I mean, we
So,
have a pretty good sense that all this stuff did actually happen. And there was this it is kind of explained a little bit in the book, but during World War II, the Japanese viewed it as completely dishonorable to surrender, which I mean, we're aware of from other media that we've watched, in the Pacific, them doing the bonsai charges or officers, they would rather commit suicide than be captured and all that kind of stuff. And so they thought that Americans who allowed themselves to be captured instead of killed were dogs, basically. They were the lowest of
right,
low. So they didn't
right,
mind mistreating them because they didn't see them that they deserved to be treated well.
right. And I feel like the bird keeps saying, he says it like 3 or 4 times in the movies. In the movie, you are enemies of Japan, is what he keeps repeating, and you'll be treated as such.
And then I
So
believe next we get the famous log holding scene, which I think is in the poster for the movie.
it is. The poster is just him holding up the beam, and the beam kind of splits the poster in two.
So just to kind of describe what happens in the scene, the bird forces Louis to pick up this huge beam and hold it over his head. And he tells the other officers, look, if he drops it, then shoot him. And so Louis actually ends up holding up the beam for 37 minutes, they say in the book, according to
Wow.
someone else who was there. And then he does drop it, but the fact that he was able to hold it up for so long is really kind of it really kind of made the bird look foolish, right? That fact that Louis was able to stand up to him in this way.
Yeah. And then he beats him up. He does often in this film. And
Yes,
there's
he does.
a scene, or there's a couple of shots as he beats him up where there's like white light and Louis is thinking about when he was running, and it's in slow motion, and it's like the hero shot from Lord of the Rings when Frodo sees all of his friends again, and I hate it. And
I know. It's almost heavy-handed because it's quite obvious that the metaphor of Louis as a distance runner, where distance running requires like perseverance and focus and determination, is kind of a metaphor for how he survived the war. And then
yes,
they don't want you to miss that. They make that real
right.
clear.
They do a lot of hand holding in this movie because there's another point that happens earlier in the movie. Fitzgerald, which is also I think an officer in the other camp, says to Louis and others, he says, if the Allies win this war, the Japanese will issue a kill. And it's an interesting moment in the film because it comes back later in the film, very much near the end, which is where we almost are because after this they are told that first they are told that Roosevelt is dead. That's slightly earlier, I think. So they think this is not going to be good, and Fitzgerald, I believe, explains that war is ending, and as a gesture of good faith, a leader of the camp, I don't know who he is, says, you have been awarded the opportunity to go and bathe in the river, and it's very clear, to me at least, that they then intend to kill all the prisoners. But there's this a line in the movie that has one character, I don't remember who says it, but he literally says, "This is it, we're dead." It's like, it's so handholdy. Like, in case you can't figure it out, this is where they're supposed to die. And then a plane flies overhead and it's the Americans and they're saved and the war's over.
Yeah, there's quite a bit of that ground that gets covered in the book where where in the book they're focused on Louis, but you're also finding out what's happening to Phil and what's happening to some other guys. And they're all very aware of the fact that if the Americans win the war, they're gonna die. Like they're not gonna survive being rescued, essentially. And so I guess they really wanted to make sure to depict that in the movie.
Yeah, I feel like Angelina Jolie must have thought, or the writers, I don't know actually, must have thought that maybe this audience would be young or stupid, either one of those, because it is really obvious. And then they have to say it, and it kind of takes the tension out of the moment a little bit, because it's so much better if it's unsaid. You can just see their faces and their tension and their kind of the show don't tell principle that they miss here, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, there's just a lot of that in the movie where it becomes more of a allegory about, I don't know, courage and perseverance instead of us being focused on these characters or these people as real people
Right.
and us being able to kind of follow the plot without being necessarily spoon-fed everything.
And I feel like that's reinforced too by the fact that they only use nicknames very often. So if you want to look up these stories, the only one you get is Louis Zamperini, basically, and the rest you only get first names or nicknames. So
Yeah.
if you want to look those characters up or those people up who actually existed, you're gonna have to do some digging, is what I'm saying. They could have done better in that regard, I feel. But
Yeah.
it's a very kind of Hollywood fiction of this story, I think.
Louis and the other POWs do end up getting liberated at the end of the war and they return home. Part of the reason, I guess, why they were treated better than they thought they were going to be treated was I became clear, I think, to a lot of the Japanese officers that, I mean, already MacArthur was drawing up lists of war criminals, that there were going to be trials for war criminals. So a lot of the Japanese officers, instead of sticking around to carry out this kill all order, they just left.
And you also see the bird also leaves, and Louis briefly goes up into his office and looks at this photo, I believe, this family photo. Kind of,
Yeah, that part kinda confused me because I was like, "Are they trying to humanize him?" I guess, for
I
2
think
seconds?
they were. I don't think they should, but they were.
Yeah.
And we see Louis return home. We see him greeted by his brother Pete, I believe, who I really like in this movie. He's nice. And then it kind of ends like that, and you get a card saying that he married his sweetheart, and you see that Phil actually survived and married his sweetheart. And it also says very briefly that he dealt with years and years of PTSD, but they don't show any of it. And then he became a religious man.
Yeah, and I believe they show that he lived to the age of 97, and he actually returned to Japan to run a leg of the Olympic torch at the Olympics in Nagano, Japan when he was 80 years old, I think.
He was 80. It says in the movie he was 80, which is
Yeah.
insane to do that at age 80. And he also apparently reconciled with a lot of his captors, but the bird refused to meet him.
Yeah, so in the book, they go into that a bit more. So after the war, there was a list of war criminals who were going to be prosecuted, and the bird was on it because the War Department in the US were essentially debriefing a lot of these guys who had been in camps. And again and again, they were hearing stories about this guy, Watanabe, the bird, about how much of a dick he was. So he was on this list of war criminals that were supposed to be prosecuted. And for a little while, a lot of the guys on this list were getting arrested and were getting prosecuted. So he went into hiding. And it seemed likely that he was probably going to be caught. He hid in the countryside for a little while. He pretended to be a laborer at a farm. He couldn't visit. He went back to visit his family once, but then he didn't see them again for 2 years because he was in hiding. And then there just reached a point where the Americans wanted to build a post-war relationship with Japan, and the prosecutions were extremely unpopular. So they sort of just quietly stopped doing it. And because of that, Watanabe just lived the rest of his life in virtual obscurity. And towards the end of his life, when Louis wanted to meet with him, he initially said yes, but then he changed his mind and said no. And they reference an interview with him in the book where he doesn't, he seems to know that that he did some things that were bad, but he doesn't think he was a bad guy. I don't know. It's interesting.
Do bad guys ever think they're bad guys?
Well, especially if you've had a whole lifetime to justify to yourself why you were doing what you were doing, right?
So that's, I think, mostly for the movie at least. Is there anything from the book you think we should mention?
Yeah, so there's a huge chunk of the book that didn't get included in the movie at all, which was Louis' no good, terrible, very bad time after he got home. And I think, I don't know, I understand why they didn't depict it in the movie because it kind of goes against the message, maybe. But he went home and he married this woman that he had known for like 2 weeks. And when they were together, he would have these terrible dreams. Sometimes he would wake up and he would be choking her. That was mentioned at one point because he had such bad PTSD. They fought all the time. They had a kid together, but she didn't trust him to be around the kid. And so they split up for a little while. And he was just having a terrible time. Substance abuse, like he was drinking all day, every day, was never sober, and was just angry all the time. And at the time, of course, I think he went to speak to some kind of counselor or something, and the person just really was no help because at the time, obviously, people weren't going to therapy at the rate that they are today. And so he really was on a downward spiral and he had lost his family and all that stuff. And then he saw a sermon by Billy Graham that I believe his wife dragged him to. Billy Graham, the famous evangelical Christian. And I don't know, he didn't seem to really enjoy himself, but then he let his wife drag him to another one. And he gradually started to really identify with the message. And so after that, he was able to become a better family man, and his wife didn't divorce him after all. And it totally turned everything around for him.
So I'm the biggest atheist on the planet, but if that helps, then good for you.
Right. If it makes you the kind of person who can raise your kid and not be
Right.
a drunken jerk, then sure.
That's quite a whirlwind at the end of his life, then I guess. Be or after maybe not even the end of his life, just after the war. He'll
Yeah,
be first not very much enjoying marital bliss, then almost divorcing, and then being saved by religion,
right. And
basically.
you got to think this whole PTSD, drinking too much, mistreating his family, all that kind of stuff was probably a pretty common story. A lot of these guys came back. They were young. They didn't necessarily have any emotional tools to be dealing with this stuff, especially because so much of masculinity at the time was just tied up in how like stoic and brave and stiff upper lip you could be. And so they didn't have any emotional tools and they had this brain full of trauma soup. You got to think that this was a story for a lot of people, and maybe that hasn't been as widely discussed and shared.
I wonder how much, in general, religion helped veterans of World War II, like, or just not just veterans, but anyone with trauma when there wasn't any other place to kind of look.
Right. Yeah, I mean, super
Um,
possible. And they did in 2018, I think, they made a super low budget evangelical sequel to this movie. Almost nobody from the original movie came back. I think one or two of the small role actors might have, but it was just a movie about Louis Zamperini finding Jesus, I guess.
I mean, is it made by the same people?
No, definitely not. But it's still listed as a sequel on Wikipedia.
Amazing. I feel like we should devote another episode to whatever that is.
Yeah, but then we'd have to watch it. You know who made it? I think it was the son or the grandson. I think the grandson of Billy Graham, the
Oh
original
man.
evangelist that converted Louis Zamperini. And I mean, I'm not religious either. These people are not my people. So yeah, guaranteed the movie is very deeply weird, super Christian vibes.
I probably won't watch the movie again because, as you can tell, I'm a little bit skeptical about how I feel about this movie. But I will read the book, or rather, I would probably listen to the audiobook instead. Because we got a little message from a Tumblr user named No Need to Amputate about the audiobook for this. The American English version is voiced by the late Edward Herman. If you don't know who he is, he portrayed Richard Gilmore on Gilmore Girls, and I really like him in that. And this person also said that he is one of their favorite audiobook narrators, so he must be good. So I'll look into that one so that I can finally be on the same page as
Yeah, I definitely recommend the book. It was an enjoyable read. I pretty much got through it. I mean, I read part of it before I started taking my course, and then I took a break to take my course, and then I pretty much picked it right back up and finished it. So I definitely recommend it to anyone who's interested in reading about the Pacific Theater of Operations. There's lots of cool stuff in there about the fact that Louis was a bombardier. So if you're interested in plane stuff, I know Masters of the Air has been out recently, so people are kind of into that. So it's a cool story from that perspective. It's a shipwreck story. It's a prisoner of war story. So this guy went through a lot, and the book does a really good job of pulling that story together and making it interesting.
excellent. I will look forward to reading it. I think all that's left to do for us is thank you for listening, and to let you know that you can follow us on Instagram at Rosie the Reviewer Podcast, and you can subscribe to this podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and Amazon Podcasts and just about anywhere else you'd like. And if you want, you can send us questions and we'll try our best to answer them in a future episode, or you can give us recommendations. We love all that stuff. I hope you keep listening and that we can count on you to be there next week.
Are you reading anything right now?
It's getting kind of embarrassing because Sam assumes I have time in my busy schedule of editing and drawing and painting and working to read any books.
It's true, you guys. I do make her do all of the editing because I'm a terrible person and a hack and a fraud. But
I did also kind of volunteer to do all this, let's be fair.
yeah, I mean, I did not browbeat you into it, but I do really appreciate that you're doing it. Thank you.
It's really fun, actually. Maybe I'll
Well,
do like once we get 100 subscribers, which please follow us, guys. If we get 100 subscribers, we can do extra content. And then maybe I'll do a little how-to on podcasting.
that's a good idea. If there's anything we need, it's more podcasts by idiots who like to ramble about their niche topics.
Are you calling me an idiot?
I'm calling us both idiots, but affectionately.
That's fine then. Okay. See you next week, guys.
No, you're not going to ask me about my book when I just read a whole book last night?
What's your book?
So I did read a whole book last night. It's called Violet Szabo, The Life That I Have, I believe. And it's about a woman who was a British spy during World War II. And she was one of 13 female British spies, I believe, who was executed. She was killed at Ravensbrück in 1945. And there is actually a movie about her, which we may cover on a future episode. It's called Carve Her Name with Pride. And I haven't watched it yet, but it is available on YouTube if anyone wants to check it out in advance of that. But the book is good.
Don't review it before we do, because that's our thing.
I mean, if it's honestly, by all means, watch it. And then if we talk nearly as much shit about it as we did about Unbroken, you'll enjoy it more because you'll know why it's terrible.
Are you done? Is this it? See you next week.